Hi, I'm Brighid Doherty of the Solidago School of Herbalism here on Deer Isle. Today we're at the Pine Hill Preserve talking about evergreen plant medicine. We're going to be IDing different medicinal evergreen plants and talking about their various uses. Something that's great to know about evergreen trees is there's a lot of similarities between their medicinal constituents and how you can use them. So a lot of the evergreens that are medicinal are very high in volatile oils, which it gives them that wonderful evergreen scent. And those volatile oils have wonderful effects on our body. First off, they tend to be very beneficial for our respiratory tract to help open, improve breathing, and relieve coughs. And they tend to be quite anti-infective because, after all, those volatile oils are the plant's own defense mechanism against invading bacteria, insects, and viruses. Another great benefit that those volatile oils provide us are they help to eliminate gas and cramping, especially after eating. So they are great for easing digestion. And then another benefit of those volatile oils is they help with wound repair and preventing infections on wounds topically. So these are all benefits of the evergreens. Now let's dive into each one specifically and see what affinities each plant brings to us. All right, so here we are at a beautiful white pine tree. It's a pretty young tree that can grow quite large. And this is probably one of the most well-known evergreens, is the pine. And actually a lot of people will call just any evergreen pine. But it's really important to know the difference between your evergreens. So a pine tree has these long needles that are in clumps. And the white pine needles are in clumps of 5. Although this one was in 4. Clumps of 5, and they have a white line that goes up one side of the white needle. You can harvest the pine boughs that fall on the ground after a really windy storm. So you don't actually have to do any damage to the tree to harvest the pine needles for use. Now, one thing that the white pine is really well known for is it's very high in vitamin C. So it's an excellent source of vitamin C throughout the year. And you can harvest the needles any time of year, and like I said, after a windstorm preferably. Also, those volatile oils in the white pine specifically are used to help ease coughing, as an expectorant to help you cough up excess mucus in the lungs, and as an anti-infective to fight off any infections that might be trapped in your respiratory tract. You can make a tea of the white pine needles. You can include the little stems too that are attached to the needles, and those have some more of those resins with the volatile oils in them. So a little bit of the needles and a little bit of the twigs, and you can just pour boiling hot water over them and let them steep for 20 minutes to make a nice tea. And you can drink that throughout a day, multiple cups throughout a day if you are fighting a respiratory infection. Now you could also simmer a pot of pine needles and stems and do a steam so that you're actually breathing in those volatile oils through your respiratory tract. So again, just chop up a bunch of the needles and some stem, put it in a pot of water, bring it up to a boil, take it off of the stove, put a towel over your head, don't burn yourself, make sure it's not too hot, and then put your head over the pot and breathe in that lovely steam. Another great way to use the gifts of the pine tree are by harvesting some of the resin or the sap or the tar that you will see that is exuding from a wound from the pine tree. So that's actually, it's really sticky, and that's actually the scab, almost like the healing blood and scab of the tree to help heal the wound and keep infection from breeding in that wound of the tree. And so all of those properties and principles can also be used for our own wounds and healing. So what a lot of times people will do is they'll harvest a little bit. You still want to leave enough to keep the plant's health intact. but you can harvest a little bit of that sap or tar or resin and bring it home, and you can freeze it, put it in the freezer. It's a lot easier to work with because it's not as sticky. Freeze it, and then once it's frozen, take it out and pound, put it in some cloth or a plastic bag and pound it with a hammer to break it up. And then you want to add that to some oil and put the oil in a warm place, like even in some warm water, a double boiler situation, or in a brown paper, in a jar, in a brown paper bag, in a hot sunny window, and let it infuse for a while. And that pine resin will meld with your carrier oil. I like to use just the plain olive oil, and then you can apply that oil topically to wounds if you so desire. Another way that I love to use pine medicine, and this is a great way to maintain that vitamin C, is to harvest the fresh needles and infuse them into apple cider vinegar. So cut them up, fill a jar, and cover that jar with apple cider vinegar. And vinegar is a great way to extract minerals and nutrients from plant material. And it tastes delicious. And then you can use that vinegar in salad dressings or a seasoning on food. You could even add honey, pine needles, and vinegar together in a jar and make what's called an oxymel. And that's even more delicious. And then you can add that to cocktails or bubbly water or marinades or salad dressings for a nice pine flavor with all of the medicinal and nutrient benefits that it has to offer. The juniper berries are a nice addition to food. You can dry them whole, just as is, in a nice open weave basket. And you can add them to fish or meat. You could add them to a spice blend. They're really excellent added to sauerkraut. And then you can also pulverize them once they're dried and make a tea with them. Now, the juniper has an affinity for fighting infections in the urinary tract specifically. So any sort of chronic UTIs or cystitis, you can think juniper. And again, it's those volatile oils that are anti-infective. But those volatile oils, they work on the urinary tract because that's how we eliminate them through our body. And that's why with all of this evergreen medicine, you don't want to consume it in large amounts over a long period of time, because those volatile oils can, in the long run, become hard on the kidneys, because it's a little hard for them to constantly be, and the liver to constantly be excreting them from your body. So in the short term, very anti-infective. In the long term, it's okay to use small amounts in cooking and whatnot, but you don't want to be using them medicinally for a long time. Juniper grows all around this area, and the berries are most often harvested. You can also harvest the needles, and the berries takes 2 years for the berries to ripen. So when you look closely at your juniper bushes, you'll see that there will be green berries and blueberries, and the blue ones are ripe and the green ones are not. So when you harvest your juniper berries, you want to harvest the blue ones. So another way that you can use the juniper berries is by making a tincture with the berries, and you can even put leaves in there too. I would wait till the leaves green up more. We're in April here, and so the needles are quite dry and brown, but as spring progresses and summer, the needles turn green. Harvest those blue juniper berries and the green needles, put them in a small jar, and cover them with 100 proof vodka. Let them sit for 6 weeks, and you'll have a nice juniper tincture. Now that could be helpful both for aiding digestion, again, because of those volatile oils. You can make a nice digestive bitter with it. You could add like a bitter root and make a nice pre-dinner bitter. Or you could have it on hand in case you do have any infections in the urinary system. I love cedar. It smells so sweet and so delicious. Very mild. Traditionally it was seen as a very protective tree and was, even used to make babies' cradles to protect them, burned as an incense to create a safe space or to shift the mind to being more comfortable in a space. Also, the smell of the bark and the wood shavings and the needles help repel moths, as we know. We put them in our closets all the time to repel insects, or cedar shavings in a dog bed to help repel fleas and insects. And again, those are those volatile oils that the tree is producing to stave off invaders. My favorite way to make use of the gifts of cedar is to harvest the fresh needles and cut them up, put them in a jar, and cover them with plain olive oil. And that olive oil, let it sit for 6 weeks, and that olive oil will smell delicious at the end of those 6 weeks. And I just love to use it as a body oil. And I find that the smell of cedar just is very calming, soothing, and grounding. And could be very wound healing as well with its anti-infective properties. So here's a great example of a small spruce tree and a small fir tree. And at first it might be hard to differentiate between the two. But I like to think spiky spruce and flat fir. The spruce tends to be like, if you touch it, it's maybe more like, ow, that hurts, and not so friendly. Friendly fir is another way that people remember it. Whereas the fir tree, the needles are flatter and they kind of lie flatter, and so it's just a lot softer and not as hard on the hands to touch, is how I remember it. As they get older, the spruce bark tends to be a lot kind of rougher and like more small pieces all up and down. And the fir tree, I feel, is a lot smoother and tends to have lots of bubbles on it. And in those bubbles are some of the balsam fir resin. So if you pop those bubbles, inside will be like a gooey resinous substance that again is protecting the plant. So I love, they're not quite ready yet, not at all, but later in the early summer, when these tips begin to grow, so the tree will grow from its tips, and those fresh tips are nice bright green, very delicate and very tasty. And so that's the part of the trees that I like to use. And you can harvest them and dry them for tea. You can make fresh tea with them. You can do steams with them if you're wanting to fight a respiratory infection or sinus infection, or just to break up excess mucus. Also, I love to infuse those tips in olive oil, similar as I do to cedar, and add them to healing salves. They smell amazing, especially the fir tips. And then also you can infuse them in vinegar or honey, and the honey is delicious. You can add that to tea, or the vinegar and honey combination is great as a dressing or added to beverages. Thank you for joining me on this stroll through the Pine Hill Preserve, hosted by the Island Heritage Trust. If you're interested in learning more about herbal medicine, check out my website, solidagoherbschool.com. And also look for more projects that the Island Heritage Trust and I will be doing together in the near future.